Good evening. It's late where I am, just the lamp in the corner, the house finally quiet. That's usually when I read the letters you send me. This one came in a plain white envelope. No return address, 6 pages in careful cursive, and a photograph of a half-finished quilt folded over the back of a chair. The woman who wrote it asked me not to use her real name, so tonight I'll call her Margaret. Margaret is 7 years old. Let me read you Margaret's story, in her own order, the way she sent it. Only the names are changed. The hot dish came out of the oven at 6:15, the way it always had. The tater tots had gone golden across the top, and the cream of mushroom was bubbling brown at the edges of the dish. Margaret Ellison said it on the trivet Roy had bought her at a church bazaar a lifetime ago, and she stepped back to let the steam go. 40 years of 12-hour shifts, and she still couldn't sit down to eat the second the food was ready. Some habits the body keeps long after the reason for them is gone. 5 places at the table. She'd set them herself, the good plates because Sandra was coming, and the cloth napkins folded into neat triangles. Out the kitchen window, the maples along the back fence were dropping their last leaves into the neighbor's yard, and the light had gone that thin October blue. That means the cold is coming for real now. Smells like 1995 in here, Danny said, dropping into his chair. Her son was 39, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with work, since he hadn't had steady work since spring. He'd grown a beard that didn't suit him. You still make this? I still make this, Margaret said. Brooke came in behind him, one hand pressed to the small of her back, the other resting on the curve of her belly. 5 months along now, maybe a little more. She lowered herself into the chair with a sigh that was meant to be heard. It's an awful lot of dairy, isn't it? She said. Not quite a question, peering down into the dish. The baby books say to watch the dairy. There's a salad, Margaret said, and there was, in the wooden bowl, the one nobody would touch. Sandra arrived last, Brooke's mother. She came in a quilted vest and a cloud of department store perfume, and she'd driven up from Aiken, and she let everyone know it. The traffic on 494, the construction, the price of gas these days. She sat herself at the foot of the table like she'd been shown to the seat by an usher. Margaret had met Sandra exactly 4 times in 8 years, and each time, the woman had looked at the house, at the paid-off, 3-bedroom, corner lot house with the slow appraising sweep of a real estate agent. The only one who hugged Margaret was Lily. Hi, Grandma, 18 now, a freshman at the university, home for the weekend with a duffel bag of laundry. She wasn't Margaret's blood. She was Danny's girl from his first marriage, from Annie, who died of a brain aneurysm when Lily was 7, and the whole world had gone sideways for a while. Margaret had done a good share of the raising after that. The school pickups, the scraped knees, the talk about periods that Danny couldn't manage. Lily smelled like the cold and like the girl she'd always been. Storm at sea's looking good, she said, nodding toward the sewing room off the hall, where the quilt hung half-finished on the design wall. It's giving me fits, Margaret said. All those little points have to line up just so, or the whole thing looks drunk. Lily laughed, and for a minute it was just the two of them, the way it usually was. They ate. Brooke pushed the tots to one side of her plate and talked about the baby registry, the stroller that turned into a car seat that turned into something else, a contraption that cost more than Margaret's first car had. Danny was quiet, which she should have noticed. He kept glancing at his wife between bites, some signal passing between them that Margaret couldn't read. And Sandra kept her eyes down on her plate with a small, private smile, the look of a woman who has already seen the end of the movie. It was Brooke who started it, gentle as anything. Margaret, we wanted to talk to you about the room. Which room? The sewing room. Brooke set her fork down. It's really the only one that makes sense for the nursery. It's right next to ours. It gets the morning light. It's the right size. She said it the way you describe a decision that's already been made, walking someone slowly toward a conclusion you reached without them. We'd help you move all your fabric and everything. We'd be so careful with it. Margaret looked across the hall at her sewing room, the shelves of folded cotton sorted by color, Roy's old recliner in the corner, where he used to sit and read while she worked, the design wall, the long cutting table, her machine. It was the room where she had spent most of the 6 years since the funeral, the room where she would stop, some evenings in the middle of pinning a seam, just to feel that she was still a person who made things. "That's my workroom," she said evenly. "Mom." Danny leaned in. His voice had taken on that reasonable, patient tone he used when he decided he was the only adult in the conversation. "You can quilt anywhere. You could set up down in the basement. Honestly," and here it came, the thing they'd driven up from Egan for, the thing the good plates and the folded napkins had been the stage for all along. "Honestly, we've been talking, and we think maybe it's time to think bigger picture. About the house, about what makes sense for you long term." "Long term," Margaret repeated. "There's a place out by us, Cedar Pines." Brooke had a brochure. She actually had one in her bag. She didn't pull it out, but she touched the bag where it was. "It's beautiful, Margaret. It's not what you're picturing. Active senior living, they call it. They've got a craft room. You'd have people your own age. You wouldn't be rattling around all alone in this big house. And the baby would have room to grow," Sandra said from the foot of the table. It was the first whole sentence she'd offered all night. And there it was, laid out on the cloth between the hot dish and the untouched salad. "Give us your room. Then give us your house. Then go," said with a brochure, said over a meal Margaret had cooked with her own 2 hands in the kitchen she'd paid for, in front of the daughter she had half raised. Lily had gone very still. Margaret saw her set her fork down without a sound and look at her father and look at Brooke and open her mouth and find nothing in it. 18 years old, ambushed at her own grandmother's table. Sandra studied her water glass. Danny, at least, had the grace to look somewhere over Margaret's left shoulder. Margaret waited for the anger. She'd nursed for 40 years. She knew her own body. She knew the way fury comes up the back of the neck and settles into the jaw. She waited for it, and it didn't come. What came instead was something she hadn't felt in a very long time, a quiet, level clarity, like a lamp clicking on in a room she'd quit going into. For one strange, weightless moment, she could see the whole table the way it actually was, with nothing in front of it. She saw a woman being measured for the door. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. She picked up her napkin, blotted the corner of her mouth, and set it back down beside her plate. "All right," she said. "Let me think on it." The relief around that table was almost funny. Brooke smiled and said, "Of course, no rush. We just wanted to start the conversation." Danny said something about how he'd known she'd be reasonable. Sandra reached for the salad at last, now that the hard part was behind them. They thought they'd won. They thought the quiet was a yes that just needed a little time to ripen. Only Lily kept watching her grandmother's face. And what she saw there, she didn't have a name for yet. Margaret did the dishes alone. She always did. Danny took Brooke up to lie down. Sandra left in another cloud of perfume and complaints about driving home in the dark. Lily dried until her father called her up to help carry a box of baby things in from the car, and Margaret told her to go on. She had it. And she did have it, the warm suds, and the window gone black so that she could see only her own reflection in it. An older woman in a cardigan, hands moving the way they'd moved for half a century. When the kitchen was clean, she dried her hands, crossed the hall to the sewing room, and turned on the light. Storm at Sea hung on the design wall, 3/4 pieced. It was a hard pattern, interlocking diamonds and squares that, if you got the points right, seemed to move, to roll like water. A whole ocean made out of flat cotton and patience. Roy had picked the blues. On the last full day, he was himself. Before the stroke took most of him, and then the rest. He'd sat in that recliner and pointed at the bolts of fabric and said, "That one and that one, the deep one, like the lake before a storm." She had never been able to finish it. 6 years it had hung there, a little more done each winter, never closed. She lowered herself into Roy's recliner. The leather had gone soft and cracked where his arms used to rest. From here, she could see the room the way they wanted it. The shelves stripped bare, the machine carried down to the basement, the walls painted some soft nursery color, her whole-made world boxed up and labeled and moved out of the way of the future. She took out her phone. She wasn't going looking for it on purpose. She was only scrolling past the noise to quiet her hands, and there it was, where it had been for 3 weeks. A text from Joni Marsh she'd never answered properly. Joni had moved up north 2 years ago, after her own divorce, to a little town called Cloverdale on Birch Lake, and she was forever sending links and photos. You should come up, Marg. The leaves are turning, the loons are still here. The last one was a real estate listing, a small cottage on the water. 2 bedrooms, a screen porch, cedar shakes gone silver with age. Joni had written under it, Marg, look at this one. Someday it's you and me, coffee on that porch, watching the sun come up. Promise me someday. Margaret had sent back a little laughing face, the way you do, and gone on with her life. Now she sat in her dead husband's chair, in the room they wanted to take, and she opened the photo full screen and looked at it with eyes that had stopped pretending. The porch, the water, the price, which was a number she happened to know, because she'd been a saver her whole life, a nurse who'd never once carried a balance, was a number that did not frighten her at all. Down the hall, a door opened, and Brooke's voice drifted out, low and easy, on the phone to someone. A soft laugh, the word spring. Margaret didn't move. She looked at the little house on the lake until the screen went dark on its own. And then she turned it back on and looked some more. She slept 4 hours and woke at 5 out of 40 years of habit, before the alarm she no longer set, before the house had any light in it. She lay in the dark and did not feel tired. She felt the way she used to feel walking into a delivery that had gone wrong overnight, clear-headed, hands steady, a list already forming. By 6, she was at the kitchen table with coffee and a legal pad and the laptop open. This was the part Danny would never have believed she could do, because Danny had never once watched her do it. He thought she made hodish and quilts. He did not know that for 40 years she had run this family's money down to the dollar. He did not know she'd paid this house off 9 years early, or that she'd buried Roy without going a single cent into debt, because she'd planned for it the way she planned everything. Quietly, early, and alone. She added it all up. The savings, the part of the retirement she could reach without a penalty, the small life insurance money she'd never touched, because touching it had always felt like spending Roy. It came to more than people would ever have guessed of a retired nurse in a cardigan. She wrote the cottage price beside it. She wrote down what the listings said this house might bring, a corner lot, in a school district people fought to get into. She did the subtraction twice, because she'd taught herself long ago never to trust the first answer when she wanted it to be true. The first answer was true. She could do it. She could do all of it and have a cushion left over besides. She did not call anyone yet. She rinsed her mug, set it in the rack, and went to do the very thing she'd told them she would do. She went to start thinking about the room. Joni answered on the second ring, even though it was barely 7. Marg, is somebody dead? Nobody's dead. That cottage you sent me. Is it still up? A silence with weight in it. Margaret Ellison, don't you tease me? I'm not teasing. Is it still up? Hang on, hang on. The sound of a woman moving fast across a kitchen. It's still up. It's been up since June. The market's slow up here. Nobody wants to deal with winterizing. Marg, are you? I want to see it. Can you find out who has the listing? By 8, Joni had the realtor's number, a man named Greg Halverson, with a slow North Woods voice, and by 1:30, Margaret had an appointment to walk the property that Saturday. She told Greg when he asked that she was a serious buyer. Cash. No house to sell first, which was not yet true, but would be. She heard him sit up a little on the other end of the line. Serious cash buyers did not come along often in Cloverdale in October. She told the house she was running errands. Danny was still asleep. Brooke was up, padding around the kitchen in Margaret's own robe, eating Margaret's yogurt, and she said errands where? In that idle way that was really a small claim of ownership. Margaret said the fabric store and the bank, and was gone before any more could be asked. The drive north took 2 hours and 10 minutes, and she did not turn on the radio. She watched the suburbs thin into farmland, and the farm thin into pine, the lakes coming up silver between the trees one after another. More water than land the farther she went. She hadn't driven this far alone in years. There was always someone who needed the car, needed a ride, needed her to be reachable. She'd forgotten what her own thoughts sounded like with that much road in front of them. Greg Halverson was waiting in the gravel drive in a canvas work jacket, and the cottage behind him was better than the photo, because the photo couldn't hold the smell of it. Cedar and cold water and wood smoke from somewhere down the shore. 2 bedrooms, a screen porch facing east the way Joni had promised, so the sun would come up over the water and right into your coffee. A wood stove. A kitchen small enough that one woman could reach everything without taking a step. Out the window, the lake lay flat and dark, and as she stood there, a loon surfaced near the dock and let out that long, broken, lonesome call, the most American sound there is. And Margaret felt something in her chest she hadn't felt since before Roy got sick. She felt like she was standing somewhere that could be hers. "What do you think?" Greg asked. "I think it's right," she said. "But I'm not going to do what people do in the movies and tell you to draw up papers on the hood of your truck." He laughed, surprised. "I'll make an offer," she said, "a real one. But I want an inspection, the whole thing, the roof and the septic and the well and whatever else freezes up here. And I'll want a few weeks to get my own house sold, so I'm not carrying 2 of them. You walk me through how long all of that takes, honestly, and don't sand it down because I'm a nice lady. I used to read fetal heart strips for a living. I can take a straight answer." So he gave her one. An accepted offer, then inspection inside 10 days, then the appraisal, then the closing. 6 weeks if nothing snagged, more like 8 or 10 if something did. She wrote it all down on the legal pad against the dusty windowsill. She made her offer that afternoon, contingent and conditional and entirely real, and she drove home in the dark with the loon's cry still somewhere behind her eyes. "This is the part she wanted understood," she wrote to me later. "It was not a tantrum. She did not buy a house out of spite on a single furious night. She made a careful contingent offer like a sane woman, and then she went home and made dinner. The slowness was the point. The slowness was how she knew it was real. The folder she found on Monday. She was doing the very thing she'd promised, beginning, in good faith, to figure out where her fabric could go if it had to. The hall closet was the deepest storage in the house, and she'd cleared the bottom shelf to see whether her bins would fit. Behind the winter coats and the box of Christmas, she had to move a stack of Brooks things that had migrated there over the months, the way Brooks things migrated into every room of the house. A diaper bag, still with its tags on, a breast pump, still in the box, and a plain green folder, the accordion kind, with a rubber band around it. She would have left it. She was not a woman who went through other people's papers. But the rubber band had perished, and it snapped as she lifted it, and the folder breathed open. And what slid out onto the closet floor was a printed page she could read at a glance, because she'd been reading exactly this kind of page on her own laptop 2 mornings before. It was a property valuation, her property, the house, the address, an estimated market value with a confident green number beside it. Margaret knelt on the closet floor in the cold draft from the front door and gathered the pages up with hands that had gone very steady. The steadiness she knew from the worst nights on the ward when steady was the only thing left to be. A glossy trifold for Cedar Pines Active Senior Living, with a sticky note on the front in Brooks' round handwriting, "Call availability, spring." A printout of an email from someone who signed off as a senior transition specialist, thanking Brooke for her inquiry, attaching information about options for families, helping a parent right-size their living situation, and a single sheet of notebook paper. Brooke's handwriting, a list the way you jot down groceries, fast, for your own eyes only. Talk to Danny Ree, needs to be his name, easier if it's family. Get mom's accounts, ask about the nurse's pension, she won't say. Equity approximately equals, and there copied out was the green number. Once she settled out there, list in spring, markets better in spring. Danny soft on this, handle. Margaret stayed on the closet floor for a long time. The furnace clicked on and warm air moved over her ankles, and she did not get up. She had walked into that dinner believing she was looking at thoughtless children. Selfish, yes. Grasping, yes. But the ordinary kind of grasping that grown kids do, assuming the parent is furniture, assuming the house is theirs by some law of inheritance they've quietly already enacted. She could have survived that. That was only rudeness with a brochure. This was not that. This was a big get mom's accounts, needs to be his name, once she's settled out there. This was a woman who had sat at her table and pushed the tater tots to one side and worried out loud about the dairy, while a foot from the coats in the hall closet sat a folder that did the arithmetic of moving Margaret out of her own life and into a craft room in Egan, and turned everything she'd spent 67 years building into cash by spring. Danny soft on this handle. Her son was not the architect of it. Her son was the easy part. Her son was handle. She did not cry. She found kneeling there that she had gone somewhere past crying, into that same clear, lit, terrible calm she'd felt at the table, only colder now and steadier, because now she understood the shape of the thing she was up against. She took out her phone and photographed every page, one at a time, the valuation, the brochure, the email, and most of all the list, with the daylight from the open closet falling clean across Brooke's handwriting so that every word would read. She backed the photos up to her email and then to a second account Brooke had never heard of. Then she squared the pages exactly as they'd been, found a fresh rubber band in the kitchen drawer, banded the folder shut, and set it back behind the winter coats precisely where it had lived, a little deeper even, so that the move would never show. Let them keep their plan. Let them go on believing it was working. Let them believe the quiet at the dinner table had been a yes. Because now Margaret had a plan too, and hers had started 2 days before theirs ever found out, on a porch up north, where the sun came up over the water, and a loon called once across the cold, and nobody, not one living soul, owned a single thing she had not chosen to give them. She closed the closet door. Down the hall, the baby stroller leaned in its box against the wall of the room they were already calling the nursery. She walked past it to the kitchen and put the coffee on, because it was nearly time to start dinner. And as far as anyone in that house knew, Margaret Ellison was thinking it over. She did not move on the folder for 2 days. She let herself sit with it the way she'd learned to sit with a hard diagnosis before she acted on it, long enough to be sure her hands were steady and her thinking was clean. And when she was sure, she made an appointment with a lawyer. Patricia Donnelly kept her office above a bakery on Main Street in Stillwater, so the whole place smelled of fresh bread by 10 in the morning, and Margaret decided she trusted a lawyer whose waiting room smelled like that. Patricia was 60 herself, with reading glasses on a chain and a coffee mug that said World's Oakiest Golfer. A woman from Margaret's old quilt guild had given her the name. Patricia had handled the woman's divorce, she said, without ever once making her feel small. Margaret laid it all out on the desk in order the way she'd have given a report at shift change. Clean, chronological, no editorializing. The dinner, the brochure, the offer she'd made on the cottage. And then she opened her phone, turned it around, and let Patricia scroll through the photographs of the folder, one page at a time. Patricia read the notebook list twice. Then she set the phone down and took her glasses off. All right, she said. First, the part you came in here worried about, so you can put it down. This house is yours. Sole title? Sole title. Paid off. Then there is no version of this where your son or his wife has any claim on it. Not a legal one. Not because they live there. Not because he grew up there. Not because she's pregnant. You could sell it tomorrow to a perfect stranger, and you wouldn't owe one of them a phone call. People in your son's position threaten to sue. They almost never can, and they almost never do. And the moment they talk to a lawyer of their own, that lawyer tells them exactly what I'm telling you and sends them a bill. So let him bluster if he blusters. It's air. Margaret nodded slowly. She'd suspected as much. It was a different thing to hear it from a woman with a law degree and a bakery underneath her. The part that isn't air, Patricia went on, tapping the desk where the phone had been, is this. Talk to Danny Ripoe needs to be his name. This is the only thing in that folder that could actually hurt you. And it's the thing most people never see coming. They're not really after the house, Margaret, or they are, but the house is just the prize. The tool is this. Power of attorney. If they can talk you into signing a financial power of attorney, and people get talked into it all the time, usually framed as just in case, mom, just for emergencies, then they don't need your permission for anything anymore. They become you on paper. They can move the accounts, list the house, sign at the closing, and they can do all of it while smiling at your dinner table. She wrote that it should be in his name, Margaret said. Danny's, because it's easier if it's family. Of course she did. His name on the document, her hand on the wheel. Patricia put her glasses back on. Here is what we're going to do, and we're going to do it today, so it's done before anybody thinks to ask you for anything. We're going to put it in writing, formally, that you are of sound mind, which you plainly are. And we're going to name your financial and medical powers of attorney ourselves to people you choose, so that if anyone ever produces a document down the road naming your son, there's a later witnessed, attorney-drafted instrument that overrides it. So, who do you trust? Not whose family. Who do you trust? Margaret thought about it. Joni Marsh, my friend up north, for the money side. She's careful. She's honest. She balanced a church budget for 15 years. She paused. And medical. Lily, my granddaughter. The granddaughter's 18? That's fine. Legally fine. You sure about her? With her father in the picture? She's the only one of them, Margaret said. Who looked sick at that table? Patricia wrote it down. Then she pulled a fresh pad toward her. Last thing, and then I'll let you get back to your day, your will. When did you last do it? After Roy, 6 years ago. Everything to Danny. We're going to revisit that, Patricia said, and the way she said it was kind, but it was also a door easing shut on the old arrangement. Not out of spite, out of clarity. You decide where your 40 years goes, Margaret, not the folder. It went faster than she'd thought it could. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret built her exit the way she'd once built a nursing rotation, quietly, with redundancy, no single person ever able to see the whole board. She rented a climate-controlled storage unit out in Forest Lake, a town neither Danny nor Brooke had any reason to drive through, and she paid a year up front in cash. She moved nothing all at once. She moved the way water moves through a wall, a little at a time where no one's watching. Roy's tools, 2 boxes a week in the trunk under a quilt, dropped off on her way to the fabric store. The photo albums that actually mattered, not the ones she kept out of duty. Her mother's wedding ring, the good thread. She told Greg Halverson yes to the inspection, and it came back clean, but for a soft sill on the porch, which she talked $4,000 off the price for, because she was nobody's nice lady when there was money on the table. The appraisal cleared. The closing on the cottage was set for the second week of December, and she met twice with a different realtor than Greg, a brisk young woman named Andrea, who handled the suburb side. They worked out the strategy for selling this house, showing scheduled only on weekday mornings when Danny was at the temp job he'd finally taken and Brooke was at her midwife appointments. Andrea, who had clearly handled delicate situations before and asked no questions, agreed to all of it. A lockbox would go on the side door, not the front, where it couldn't be seen from the street. Joni drove down twice to help haul, and the two of them did not spend the whole time talking about Danny. They talked about the porch, and what color to paint the trim, and whether the wood stove drew well, and whether Margaret would finally get herself some chickens. Chickens, Marg. You always wanted chickens, and Roy always said no. And Margaret, lifting a box of fabric into Joni's truck in a storage lot in Forest Lake, laughed for real, the first real laugh in a month, and said, maybe chickens. It should have felt like grief. Some of it did, but more of it felt like the thing she hadn't had a word for since she was a young woman. It felt like the future being something that belonged to her again. The night she almost called it all off was the second Tuesday in November, 3 weeks before the closing, and she's never been ashamed to tell about it, because she thinks the note being ashamed is the whole point. She was lying awake in the guest room. She'd quietly moved her own things into the small back bedroom weeks before, telling them it was easier on her hip, letting them have the big room they'd already half claimed, because it cost her nothing now and it bought her peace. And she was thinking about the baby, not about Brooke, not about the folder, about the baby. She had spent 40 years catching babies. She knew exactly what was coming for that small, unmet person, the first cry, the impossible newness, the weight of it. And she was about to do a thing that would mean she wasn't there for it. No grandmother down the hall, warming a bottle at 3 in the morning. No one to say, "Here, give the baby to me, you sleep." She thought about Lily at that age, the way she'd held her through croup, the steam in the bathroom, the small hot weight against her chest. And she thought, I am going to miss the whole beginning of a child's life, and that child has done nothing wrong. The guilt came up the back of her neck the way the anger never had. It came up huge and old and shaped exactly like every other time in her life. She had talked herself out of her own door for the good of somebody else. She picked up her phone. She found Danny's name. Her thumb hovered over it. She would tell him she'd reconsidered. She'd say, we'll make the basement work, we'll figure out the room, family helps family. She'd unsay all of it. The relief of it was so close she could feel her shoulders start to loosen. And then, through the cold air return vent that ran up the wall from the kitchen, the vent that had carried sound through that house for 30 years, that had carried the smell of every dinner and the murmur of every late conversation up to whoever lay awake above it, she heard Brooke's voice. Brooke was on the phone down in the kitchen, low and easy, the way you talk, when you think the whole house is asleep. No, the gray-green, the one I sent you, for the nursery. A pause, a soft laugh. I know. No, she's been weird, but she'll come around. She always does. She's literally never said no to him in her life. Another pause. Spring, probably. Once she's out there, she'll settle. My mom says they always settle. And then it's just paperwork. A longer pause. And then lighter, almost fond, which was the worst part because it was so casual. God, I cannot wait to have this whole place to ourselves. Margaret lay in the dark with her thumb still over her son's name. She did not feel the guilt drain away. That is not what happened, and she wanted me to know it isn't, because the stories make it too clean. The guilt did not leave her. She just set it down, the way that, after 40 years, you learn to set down the patient you couldn't save. Not because you've stopped caring, but because there is another room, another night, another life that needs your hands, and this time it was going to be her own. She put the phone on the nightstand, screen down. She's literally never said no to him in her life. Watch me, Margaret said, to the dark, to the vent, to nobody. Quietly, the way she said everything now, and she rolled over and she slept. The strangest weeks of Margaret's life were the ones in which, on the surface, nothing changed at all. She still made dinner. She still ran the dishwasher and folded the towels the way she liked them and put the trash out on Tuesday nights. From the outside, she was exactly the mother-in-law she'd always been, moving through the rooms of the house on her quiet errands. And Danny and Brooke read that sameness as surrender. They thought the dinner had done its work. They thought she was settling, the way Brooke's mother had promised them people always do, and they relaxed into the house like it was already theirs, which, in their own minds, it nearly was. But Margaret was not this woman doing the same things. She was a woman walking through a house she had already half emptied, smiling at people who didn't know the floor was being taken out from under them, one board at a time. Every morning she woke and ran the list, closing in 19 days, 18. The storage unit 2/3 full. Andrea texting that the third showing had gone well, a young couple, a teacher and a nurse. A nurse? Margaret Andrea wrote with a little smiley, not knowing what that would mean to her, that the house would go to a nurse. She got good at the double life, and that frightened her a little. She had spent 67 years unable to tell even a small lie without her ears going red. Now she could stand in her own kitchen and tell Brooke she'd been at the fabric store, just browsing, with the storage unit key still warm in her pocket and not so much as blink. She decided she would not be ashamed of that either. There is a kind of honesty you owe people, and these were people who kept a folder in the hall closet. She owed them nothing now but the door. The boundaries she began to set were small, and she set them carefully, only a few, each one different, because she'd learned long ago on the ward that if you say no to everything, you become noise, and people stop hearing you. So she chose. The first was about money, and it was easy, almost bracing. Brooke came to her in the second week of November with a contractor's estimate for the nursery. New paint, new flooring, a closet system because the sewing room's old shelving wouldn't work for a baby. $1,100. and the way she set the paper down on the counter made it perfectly clear who was expected to pay. "And who's covering this?" Margaret asked, the way she would once never have dreamed of asking. Brooke blinked. "Well, it's the house. It's an improvement to the house." "It's a nursery," Margaret said. "It's your nursery. If you want it done, you'll want to do it yourselves." And she handed the paper back and went on chopping her onions. And that was the whole of the conversation. Brooke stood there a moment with her mouth working, and then she took the estimate and left. And Margaret heard her on the stairs saying, "Danny, your mother is being so weird about money lately." And Margaret thought mildly, "Yes, I am." Finally. The second boundary wasn't easy at all. It's the one she still can't tell without her voice doing something. She came home from a storage run on a Thursday afternoon, and there were bags out at the curb, the white plastic kind, stuffed full, set out for the donation truck that came on Friday mornings. She wasn't going to look. She had no reason to look. But one of the bags had slumped over in the wind and spilled, and there, caught on the asphalt at the top of it, was a corner of fabric she knew the way you know your own hand. Blue, the deep blue, like the lake before a storm. She crouched at the curb in her good coat and pulled it free, and it was one of Roy's quilts. Not Storm at Sea, that was still safe on the design wall, but the small one, the lap quilt she'd made him the winter he was sick. The one he'd kept over his knees in the recliner those last months. The one that still, if she pressed her face into it, which she would not do at the curb, smelled like him. And underneath it in the bag was the cigar box of his keepsakes that she kept up on the closet shelf, his reading glasses, his pocket knife, his watch. Brooke had been clearing out the closet for the move, for the nursery, for space. She'd gone through the shelves and decided what stayed and what went, and had not asked, and this is the part Margaret understood. Crouched at the curb, she had not even known. To Brooke, it was an old blanket and a box of an old man's junk, taking up a shelf she wanted. She hadn't been cruel about it. She'd been something worse than cruel. She'd been blind to it as a thing that could matter at all. Margaret carried the quilt and the cigar box back into the house. Brooke was at the kitchen island with a smoothie. "This was in the donation bags," Margaret said. She set the box down on the counter. She kept the quilt folded over her arm. "Oh yeah, I was clearing out the hall closet. There was so much old. This is Roy's." "I didn't know whose it." "This is the quilt he died under," Margaret said. Not loud. Brooke went quiet. "And this is his watch." "You put my husband's watch out for the truck." For 1 second, something crossed Brooke's face that might, in a better person, have become shame. Then it smoothed over. "Margaret, I'm sorry, I genuinely didn't realize. But honestly, we have to make space somehow. The baby's coming whether we—" "You don't have to explain," Margaret said. And she meant it in a way that Brooke entirely misheard as forgiveness. She took the box and the quilt upstairs, and she did not come down for dinner. And that was the night the last soft thing inside her closed. Quietly, all the way, like a door easing shut in a house where everyone's asleep. She'd wondered, in her weak Tuesday night hours, whether she was being too hard, whether the folder had been a one-time bad idea, whether the baby tilted it all back toward staying. The curb gave her the answer. You do not put a grieving woman's husband out with the trash by accident. You do it because you have stopped seeing her as a person at all. The week before Thanksgiving, the lie very nearly came undone. There was a showing scheduled for Wednesday morning. Andrea had it set for 10, when Danny would be at the temp job and Brooke at her 30-week checkup. At 9:45, Margaret stood at the side door and watched the agent's car pull up with the young couple, and she lifted her purse to leave the way she always did, so the house would be empty for the walkthrough. And then Danny's car turned onto the street. He was home. He shouldn't have been home, but the temp agency had sent everyone off early for the holiday, and there he was, pulling into the driveway, while Andrea's clients were already climbing out of their own car with that bright, house-hunting look on their faces. Margaret's heart did the thing it used to do in a crashing delivery, the thing where it went very fast and very quiet at the same time. She walked out to meet her son in the driveway before he could reach the agent, and she heard her own voice come out as smooth as still water. "Danny, good, you're home early. These are friends of Andrea's from my quilt guild. They're thinking about the neighborhood. I told her they could take a peek at the layout, since ours is the only split level on the block that's been kept up. She turned to the couple, easy as anything. Come on in, I'll show you the kitchen. Danny, would you run and grab the mail? I'm expecting a check. And Danny, who had never in his life paid close enough attention to his mother to catch her in anything, said, Sure, Ma, and went for the mail. And Margaret walked two strangers through the house that was being sold out from under him, narrating the morning light and the storage in the eaves, while her son flipped through catalogs at the end of the drive. The couple made an offer that night. It was the offer she took. She stood at the kitchen sink afterward, her hands shaking just slightly in the warm water, and she understood that she was 3 weeks from free, and that the only thing that could undo it now was her own nerve giving out. She decided her nerve would not give out. Lily figured it out the weekend before Thanksgiving. She came home for laundry and found her grandmother in the sewing room taking Storm at Sea down off the design wall, folding it with the care you'd give something alive. Lily stood in the doorway and looked at the half-empty shelves. Margaret had been thinning them for weeks, slow enough that Danny and Brooke never clocked it, and Lily, who was 18 and sharper than any of them, said, Grandma, where's all your fabric going? Margaret looked at her for a long moment. She hadn't planned to tell anyone. But this was Lily, who had looked sick at the table. And a person has to decide who in this life she'll trust with the truth, before the truth is safe. And Margaret had decided weeks ago in Patricia's office that it was this girl. Shut the door, sweetheart, she said, and she told her. Not all of it, not the folder, not yet. That was a weight she would not hang around an 18-year-old's neck. But the cottage, the lake, the sale, the leaving. The fact that in less than 3 weeks her grandmother would be living 2 hours north, and her father did not know. Lily sat down on the edge of Roy's recliner and was quiet for a long time. Then she said, at the dinner, when Dad said the thing about Cedar Pines, her jaw was tight. I should have said something. I've hated myself for 3 weeks that I didn't say something. Everybody was just being so normal about it, like it wasn't the most insane. She stopped. Are you okay? Like, actually? I'm better than I've been in 20 years, Margaret said, and Lily heard that it was true. Good. Lily wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, angry at herself for the tears. Good. Then I'm not going to tell him. I want you to know that. I'm not going to tell him, and it's killing me because he's my dad. But he sat there and let her. He's been letting her. And you shouldn't have to keep paying for him your whole life. She got up and crossed the room and put her arms around her grandmother, 18 now, and nearly as tall as Margaret, the same girl she'd held through croup. But Grandma, you have to let me come up there. You have to let me come up there all the time. Any time you want, Margaret said into her granddaughter's hair, for the rest of my life. There's a room with your name on it before there's a room for anybody else. Down the hall, the front door opened, and Danny's voice called up the stairs, tired from the holiday traffic. Ma, you start dinner? And the two of them stepped apart and wiped their faces. Lily took a breath and called back, easy as anything, we're on it, Dad, and went down to set the table for people who had no idea the table was already someone else's. The closing was on a Tuesday morning, the second week of December, in a title office in a strip mall in Stillwater, with a fake ficus in the corner and weak coffee in a carafe. Margaret signed her name what felt like 40 times. Greg Halverson was there in his good flannel, and Joni had driven down to sit beside her, and when the title officer slid the last page across the desk and said, and that's it, you're a homeowner, Joni squeezed her knee under the table hard enough to leave a mark. That same week, on Thursday, the house closed too. The young couple, the teacher and the nurse, got the house Danny had grown up in. And Margaret got a cashier's check that, after Andrea's commission and the fees, came to a little over $300,000. Because she'd lived in that house 31 years and it had been her only home, almost none of it went to the tax man. She'd checked that herself, twice at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning. She was nobody's fool about money. She never had been. It was only that no one in that house had ever bothered to find out. The new owners had agreed to take possession in January, which gave Margaret 3 weeks of legal ownership she no longer needed and did not want, and a decision about when to say the thing she'd been not saying for 9 weeks. She picked Thursday night. Lily was at school, safe, well out of it. Sandra was down in Egan. It would be just the three of them. She made pot roast because it was the last dinner she would ever cook in that kitchen, and she wanted it to be a good one. And she set the table with the good plates, the way she had the night it all started. A kind of symmetry only she could see. Danny was easy through the meal, loose, almost cheerful. The temp job had been made permanent that week. Brooke talked about the nursery, the gray-green, going up that very weekend, and Margaret let her, and passed the potatoes, and waited until the plates were nearly clean. Before dinner, she had gone to the hall closet and taken the green folder back out from behind the winter coats, and set it on the seat of the chair beside hers, where it could not be seen from the table. Now she reached down and rested her hand on it. Then she set down her fork. "I have something to tell you both," she said, "and I'm going to tell it to you once plainly, and then I'll answer your questions as honestly as I can." Danny looked up, half a smile still on him. "That sounds ominous, Ma." "I sold the house," Margaret said. "I closed on the sale this morning. The new owners take possession the second week of January. I've bought a place of my own up north, and I'll be moving there before Christmas." For a moment, neither of them moved. It was almost peaceful, that moment, the way the half second after you cut yourself is peaceful before the blood comes. Then Danny's chair scraped back. What? Mom, what are you talking about? You can't sell the house." "I did sell the house, Danny. It's done. It closed at 10 o'clock this morning." "It's not, this is." He was on his feet now, his face going through colors. "I grew up in this house. You can't just sell it. You didn't even. Were you going to tell us? Were you ever going? I'm telling you now. Where are we supposed to go?" Brooke's voice came out high and cracked. Both hands had gone to her belly. "I'm 7 months pregnant, Margaret. We have 3 weeks? You're pregnant. You're throwing a baby out on the—" "I'm not throwing anyone anywhere," Margaret said, and her steadiness against their noise was its own kind of force. They kept flinching off it like it was a wall. "You have a husband with a job that just went permanent. Congratulations on that, Danny, truly. And you are two grown adults who can sign a lease the way grown adults do. You'll find an apartment. People do it every day, with less notice than 3 weeks and a good deal less money than you've saved living here. Rent-free, the better part of a year." "Rent-free," Danny laughed, an ugly, disbelieving sound. "We're your family." And then in the very next breath, pivoting the way frightened people pivot, "I'll call a lawyer. There has to be. You can't just do this. I'll fight it. I'll—" "Call one," Margaret said. "Please do. Any lawyer you call will tell you the same thing mine did. The house was in my name alone, free and clear. You have no claim on it. None. They'll tell you that, and they'll charge you $200 to say it, and then you'll know." She let that settle. "I already had the conversation, Danny. I had it weeks ago. I've had all the conversations." That one word, weeks, went into Brooke like a needle. Margaret watched her do the arithmetic, watched her face change as she understood that the surrender at the October dinner had never been a surrender at all. That the weird mother, the one who'd been so strange about money lately, had been 9 weeks ahead of them the entire time. Brooke opened her mouth to say something, some new angle, some softer or sharper thing, and Margaret reached down beside her chair and put the green folder on the table. The accordion folder, the rubber band, she slid it into the center of the cloth, between the pot roast and the good plates, exactly where the brochure had sat in October, and she did not open it because she did not need to. "I found this," she said, "in the hall closet, back in October, 2 days after I made the offer on my cottage, which means that God or luck or something gave me the gift of finding it after I'd already decided to go. So I never had to wonder whether it changed my mind." The kitchen had gone, so quiet she could hear the furnace. Brooke's face had drained to paper. Danny was looking at the folder, then at his wife, then back at the folder, and Margaret could see the exact moment he understood that he didn't know what was inside it, but that his wife did. "Brooke," he said, "what is that?" It's a property valuation of this house, Margaret said when Brooke said nothing. And a brochure for Cedar Pines with a note in your wife's handwriting to call about availability in the spring. And an email from a senior transition specialist. And a list, Brooke. Would you like to tell him about the list? Or should I? The one where you wrote that the power of attorney needed to be in his name, because it's easier if it's family. The one where you wrote, Danny, soft on this handle. Margaret, Brooks started. You were going to take my money, Margaret said, still not loud, never loud, in my house, and put me in a craft room in Egan. And you were going to use my son's name to do it because you knew I'd never sign a single thing for you. That's not a son wanting his mother's house. I could have forgiven that. That is elder fraud planned at my own dinner table. And the only reason it's not also a police report is that you are carrying my grandchild, and I am apparently exactly the sentimental old fool you were counting on. Danny had stopped moving entirely. He was staring at his wife now, and his face was no longer angry. It had become something far worse for her. It had become understanding, slow and total and sick. Handle, he said quietly. You wrote that I was. You were handling me? Danny, that's not. It was an old note. I wrote it when I was stressed. It wasn't you sat there and let me at the dinner. You had me be the one to say the Cedar Pines. He sat down hard like his legs had quit on him. Oh my God. Margaret stood up. Out of 40 years of habit, she gathered her plate and her glass, and then she set them back down because it wasn't her kitchen anymore. Not really. And that felt right. She picked up the folder instead. This is the only copy I'll let you wonder about, she said. There are others. Safe, in places you'll never reach. In case anyone ever decides to threaten me or to contest a thing or to get creative. So don't. I've made it so you can't, and I've made it so you can't hurt yourselves trying. She looked at her son, and her voice changed, just slightly, the only crack she allowed it the whole night. I love you, Danny. I have loved you every single day of your life, and I'll love you until I die. But I am not going to set myself on fire one more time to keep you warm. You'll be 40 next year. It's time you learned to keep yourself warm. She left them there at the table, the pot roast going cold between them, the folder in her hand, and she went up to the small back bedroom and locked the door. And for a long time, she could hear them down there, not yelling at her anymore, but at each other. The low, terrible sound of a marriage finding out 3 weeks before a baby what it was actually made of. She did not feel triumphant. She wanted that understood. She sat on the edge of the bed and she ached for all of it. For the son who'd been handled, for the baby who'd be born into the middle of it, even a little for Brooke, who had learned to be this way somewhere, and probably from a woman who told her that people always settle. But she did not for 1 second think about going back down those stairs. She took out her phone and she texted Joni 3 words. I told them. The reply came in seconds. And I'm coming home, Margaret wrote. The day after tomorrow. For good. She moved on a Saturday, 2 days before Christmas, in a borrowed truck with Joni following behind in her own. There wasn't much left to load. She'd been moving the real things north for 9 weeks, a quilt and a cigar box at a time. So the last of it was furniture and the houseplants and the cast iron, and it was done by noon. Danny didn't help. He stood in the driveway in his coat, with his hands shoved in his pockets and watched, the way he'd watched once before. But at the end, when the truck was packed, he came over. He didn't try to stop her, which Margaret counted as the first grown thing she'd seen him do in a year. Can I have the address? He asked. I'm giving it to Lily, she said. If she wants to give it to you, that's hers to decide. He nodded. He'd expected that. Mom, his eyes were wet in the cold. I didn't know. The folder, I swear to God, I didn't know about the I believe you, Margaret said. And she did. That's the part that should scare you, Danny. You didn't know your own wife was planning that at your own kitchen table. And you didn't know it because you weren't paying attention, not to her and not to me. So pay attention now. You've got a child coming. She climbed up into the truck. Take care of yourself. I mean that. She didn't look back as they pulled away from the curb. She'd done her looking back already, weeks of it, a whole house of it. There wasn't any left. The first morning at the cottage, she woke before light, out of 40 years of habit, and for one disoriented moment, she didn't know where she was. Then she heard it, water against the dock, and a loon somewhere out on the dark lake, that long broken call, and she remembered, and she lay still and let herself remember all the way down. She made coffee in the small kitchen where she could reach everything without taking a step, and she carried it out to the screen porch in her robe, with Roy's lap quilt over her shoulders. And she watched the sun come up over Birch Lake exactly the way Joni had promised it would, right into her cup. The lake was frozen at the edges and steaming where it wasn't. The sky went from gray to rose to a high cold gold. She sat there until the coffee was gone and the cold finally drove her in, and she thought, nobody knows where I am, and nobody needs me, and the only person whose morning this has to be is mine. She hung Stormzy that week. She'd finished it at last in the quiet, empty days, right after the move, sitting up late and lining up the points that had defeated her for 6 years. And it turned out the trouble had never been the pattern at all. The trouble had been that she could never get an hour to herself in a house full of other people's needs. Up here, she had nothing but hours. The quilt went up on the long wall of the main room, where the morning light came in, and when it caught that light, the diamonds seemed to move, to roll, a whole flat cotton ocean made of Roy's deep blue. She'd stand in front of it with her coffee some mornings and tell him out loud that she'd finished it, that he'd been right about the blue. She did not become a different person. That's another thing the stories get wrong, she wrote. They make it sound like the woman steps out of the old life and into a shining new one and never aches again. Margaret ached. She missed her son. She lay awake some nights with her thumb over his name, the same as before, and the same as before she set the phone back down. But the ache had room to breathe now. It wasn't the whole house anymore. It was just one room, in a house with a lot of other rooms in it, and most of them had light. The light came from people. From Joni, 3 minutes down the shore. From the Thursday women, a quilt circle that met in the back room of the Cloverdale Library. 6 or 7 of them, widows and divorcees, and one woman who'd just always been alone and was the funniest of the lot. They folded Margaret in without any ceremony, the way North Country women do, by simply assuming she'd be there next Thursday and being right. There was a casserole on her step the first week, a name to go with every face by the third, and by the fifth, an argument about binding technique that she enjoyed more than any conversation she'd had in years. And then there was the thing she started in February, which she almost left out of the letter because she didn't want it to sound like a halo. There was a women's shelter one town over, in Pine City. Women starting their lives over, most of them with children, most of them with nothing. Margaret called and asked whether they could use someone to teach quilting, and the director laughed and said, "Honey, we could use someone to teach anything." So on Tuesday afternoons, Margaret loaded her good machine and a tote of donated fabric into the car and drove over and taught women how to make a thing with their own hands that would keep their children warm. Some of them had never sewn a stitch in their lives. Some of them cried over the machines for reasons that had nothing to do with the machines. Margaret didn't preach at them. She just showed them how to line the points up and told them it had taken her 6 years and a move to a lake to learn that the trouble was never the pattern. There was a young one in particular, couldn't have been 25, with a black eye gone yellow at the edges and a toddler asleep in a playpen by the window, who came every single week and barely said a word until one Tuesday in March she finished her first small quilt, a crooked, beautiful, lopsided thing, and held it up and looked at Margaret and said, "I made this. Nobody can take this. I made this." And Margaret had to go stand by the coffee for a minute. They understood her better than anyone she had ever explained herself to. The baby came at the very end of February, a girl, and they named her, of all the things in the world, Margaret Maggie. Danny called from the hospital, weeping, to tell her, and Margaret sat on her cold porch with the phone pressed to her ear and looked out at the dark water and wept too. For the granddaughter she had been so sure she would miss the whole beginning of, she did not miss it. She drove down the next week and held the baby in the bright living room of the apartment Danny and Brooke were renting now, a real apartment, leased and paid for by 2 grown adults. And the weight of that small new person against her chest was exactly the weight she remembered from 40 years of 3 in the morning deliveries. The weight that had been the whole reason for her life's work. There you are, she thought. There you are. The redemption, when it came slow the way the real things do. Danny called once a week. At first, the calls were terrible. Long silences, false starts, an apology that came out wrong and had to be tried again. He'd started seeing a counselor in January, on his own, before the baby came, which Margaret had not asked for and would not have dared to hope for. He told her in March, in a voice that shook, that he and the counselor had been talking about patterns, about taking and never giving, about how he'd let his mother carry him his whole life and called it love, because the real word for what it was had been too heavy to pick up. I was handled, he said once bitterly. And the worst part is, she could only handle me because I'd been letting you handle everything for 40 years. I never learned to do anything for myself because you always did it. And then I let somebody use that against you. He went quiet. I'm sorry, Mom. Not the kind of sorry where I want something. Just sorry. I know, Margaret said. I can hear the difference. It took you 40 years, but I can hear it. Brooke never quite got there. She sent a text in April that said she was sorry things had gotten so out of hand, which is not the same as being sorry for what you've done, and Margaret recognized the difference and let it lie. Brooke had grown up being told that women always settle. It would take her a far longer road than a few months to unlearn that, if she ever did at all, and that road wasn't Margaret's to walk for her. Their marriage, Lily reported, was thin ice all that spring. Margaret hoped it would hold for the baby's sake, and she was honest enough with herself to know she wasn't sure she hoped very hard. Lily came up one weekend a month, sometimes two, and the cottage had her name on its second bedroom, exactly as Margaret had promised. They quilted. They walked the frozen lake, and then, when April came, the thawing one. Lily started therapy of her own that spring and told her grandmother, out on the porch one evening in May with the loons back and calling across the water, that the thing she was learning was how to set a boundary and not apologize for it. I learned it from you, she said, at the dinner, the way you just put your fork down. I think about that all the time. There was one more thing Margaret had done, quietly, that nobody in that bright apartment knew about yet. She'd set it up with Patricia Donnelly back in the winter in the same office over the same bakery where she had once protected herself. The will first. She'd revisited it the way Patricia had said she should, not out of spite, out of clarity. The cottage and the bulk of what was left would go to Lily, who had been the only one to look sick at that table, and who would never, Margaret was certain, put anyone's husband out with the trash. A portion would go to the shelter in Pine City for fabric and machines and whatever a young woman with a yellow-edged black eye might need to make a thing nobody could take from her. And a smaller, fair piece would still go to Danny, because he was her son, and because she could hear, now on the phone, every week the slow and genuine work of a man becoming someone better. And then there was the trust. She'd put a real piece of her money, not a token, a real piece, into a trust. For the baby. For Maggie, before Maggie was even born, before Maggie had a name. Locked up tight, untouchable by Danny, untouchable by Brooke. Nothing either of them could borrow against or talk their way into. It would open for the child herself when she turned 25, for school, or a first house, or whatever a grown woman might need decades from now to start a life of her own choosing. Patricia had read the papers over and then looked at her over the top of the reading glasses. Margaret, after everything they tried to do to you, you're setting aside a fortune for their child. It's not their child, Margaret had said. It's the baby. The baby didn't do anything. She'd signed her name. Somebody handed every one of us a story about what we owe and who we owe it to. Brooke got handed a bad one. I got handed one that nearly ate me alive. I'm not going to hand this little girl anything at all, except a door she can walk out of with her own money the day she figures out she's allowed to. That was the last page Margaret wrote, near enough. She wrote that she sleeps now until morning, every morning, which she hadn't done in 20 years. That the chickens are coming in the spring. Roy said no for 30 years, and Roy isn't here to say it. That the quilt on the wall still moves in the morning light. that she's 67 years old, and she has friends who call to ask her to come out, not to ask her for something. A granddaughter with her name, a son who is slowly becoming a man, a lake, a porch, and a life that is, finally, after all of it, entirely her own. Margaret didn't sign her letter the usual way. No sincerely, no name, just one line at the bottom of the 6th page. They call it selfish. I call it the first time in 20 years I slept until morning. I've thought about that line all week. The photo of her quilt sits on my desk. It's finished now, and she sent a second picture, hanging in a cottage by a lake she chose herself, with no one's permission but her own. If you're somewhere quiet tonight, wondering whether wanting a little peace makes you a bad mother, a bad wife, a bad anything, I don't have advice for you. I just have Margaret and the folder she found and the morning she finally woke up to. Thank you for being here with me tonight. Take care of yourself. Good night.